inextricably, got it, inextricably linked to bison. Our bison work group is developing and will implement a bison stewardship plan to establish a comprehensive framework and eco-cultural vision for long-term bison conservation partnerships. The plan will identify specific opportunities for the Department of the Interior to lead or support establishment of additional large free-ranging bison herds. Supporting, partnering, and collaborating with tribal nations is essential, absolutely essential in this effort. And we're eager to learn more about tribal perspectives on the department's management of wild bison and how we can better align our programs to support tribal needs. We're also looking forward to, just lost the screen and of everybody in front of me. But I'll just keep going and hope you can still hear me. We're looking forward to strengthening collaboration with tribal nations through the ongoing CMR engagement effort, the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge engagement effort, and future formal consultations. I appreciate, Paul, your leadership on this over the years. And again, in conclusion, I want to thank the Society for giving me the opportunity to provide these remarks, to be here, and for your leadership. And the panel discussion is so important as an opportunity to share ideas and better understand perspectives and how we actually really move the ball forward. And I'm excited to see specific conversations and specific landscapes like the Rocky Mountain Front or on the CMR. Restoring bison populations to the landscape is complicated, but I'm confident that we will be successful if we keep working on this together. And I'm also really excited for what the future holds for buffalo conservation and with our continued partnership with tribes. I think that the time is right. So thank you for letting me join.
Thank you so much, Martha. Wow, that's great. That's inspirational for us. You know, it is. We agree. It is the time, and the time is perfect right now to start enhancing this discussion more. I know there's been a lot of discussions in the past related to this, but thank you so much for your words. We appreciate you as a partner and as a leader, and we're just great that you were here this morning with us. With that, I'd like to kind of set the stage for the rest of the meeting and do a check-in with our other presenters and panelists, and just do a little round robin there of introductions and have each other, the other presenters and panelists do a quick introduction of themselves. And I'd like to start with Tom France, if I could. Are you out there, Tom?
There we go. Thanks, Tom. Thank you, Martha, for those really great and encouraging words. I'm Tom France. I have worked on buffalo restoration for more than a decade, and as I've been on that journey with the National Wildlife Federation, it has been, I have come to appreciate and learn about and admire the commitment of the tribes and the tribal communities to buffalo restoration, and to believe strongly that tribal engagement, involvement, and leadership are absolutely essential at so many different levels. I'm now a state legislator and was very proud to be working with the American Indian Caucus at the Montana legislature, and I know my colleagues in the caucus who represent every tribe in Montana are very excited about and committed to helping where they can and moving buffalo restoration forward. And I just add, also a bit frustrated with the state of Montana kind of taking itself out of discussions about bison under the new governor I conclude by saying, I just think that increases the need for tribal engagement, and as frustrating as it is, it's also an opportunity for tribal leadership.
Thank you, Tom. Monty Mills, are you out there?
I am, Tom. Thanks so much. My name is Monty Mills. I'm a professor and co-director of the Marjorie Hunter Brown Indian Law Clinic here at the Blewett School of Law at the University of Montana. Fantastic to hear from my former office neighbor, Martha, and really appreciate the honor and privilege to be a part of this group. Been able to partner with Tom and others in support of tribal interests around bison restoration and bison issues, and through the clinic and our mission to help support tribes both here in Montana and in the region, are committed to continuing whatever we can do to assist this important project in going forward. So really pleasure to be here, and thanks again.
Thank you, Monty, for your work and participation. Keith Ani.
Good morning, everybody, and I'm glad to be here. It's wonderful to see all these faces, and I'm always inspired by seeing more and more youth get involved. As the old guy here. My original work with bison goes back to 1978 in Yellowstone Park, so that's a bit of time. But the wonderful thing is many things have happened, and there's a lot of successes, and there's also a lot of challenges, and the dialogue continues, and I'm real excited about that. And I'm glad to be here to participate. I did quite a bit of work when I was with Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and I retired from them in 2007. Went to work for the Wildlife Conservation Society and led their American Bison Society initiative, and did some work with bison across North America for about 10 years. And then I've been consulting a little bit since 2018, and Tom has invited me in to help when he was with the National Wildlife Federation, and subsequent to that, to sort of help bring some maybe senior advice, I guess, to this issue. And I'm just happy to be here. I'm really thankful that you all are willing to spend part of your day doing this, and thankful that Native American Fish and Wildlife Society is attending and paying attention to this. They have a long history as well, as do many people on this call. Thanks.
Thanks, Keith. Paul Santavy from CMR.
Good morning, everybody. Paul Santavy here. I work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm the project leader of the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge. So I'm honored to be asked to be on the panel, and I always look forward to talking about bison restoration and Fish and Wildlife Service and tribal collaboration. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Robert Magnan.
Morning, everybody. I've been working with the Four Peck Tribes Fish and Game Department roughly about 34 years now. And Four Peck Tribes reintroduced buffalo on the Four Peck Reservation back in 2000. And I've been working with them ever since they first got here. And in 2008, we first started getting interested in working on restoring buffalo in other parts of Indian country, and started working with Yellowstone National Park, Native American with Intertribal Buffalo Cooperative on restoring Yellowstone buffalo to other parts of Indian country and elsewhere.
Thanks, Robbie. Jeff Mao from Glacier National Park.
Good morning, everyone. Pleased to join you here. It's great to see so many of you that I've worked with on a variety of issues, and particularly with buffalo. You know, I had the opportunity to be engaged probably from the beginning of my time here at Glacier National Park 8 years ago, when Leroy Little Bear led the effort to sign the Buffalo Treaty, and we got the ball rolling on looking what's possible here on the East Front in and around Glacier National Park. So pleased to be part of the panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Gerald Buzz Cobell from the Blackfeet Nation.
Good morning, everybody. I apologize for not being at the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society Conference in Spokane. I had plans on being there, but COVID struck and kind of hamstrung my department operation the weekend of hunting season. And so it's been kind of affecting us in a lot of different ways, but I really look forward to this discussion this morning and glad to see everybody here. Thank you.
Thank you, Buzz. Let's see if we have Mike Fox on the line. Hopefully Mike was able to connect with us. Well, maybe not. Mike was traveling. He was going to try to catch us. So we'll go to the next panelist, Brendan Moynihan.
Close.
Sorry, close. I always mess it up, Brendan. Sorry. Brendan used to work for me.
You get 5 tries. Yeah. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Brendan Moynihan. I work for the National Park Service. I coordinate bison conservation across parks and regions in the National Park Service, and I'm also the chair of the Department of Interior's Bison Working Group. And as one of the principal authors of the Bison Conservation Initiative, along with Paul Santavy and others, I'm thrilled to hear the opening comments today by Martha to set the stage, and I'm really gratified to be part of this panel and thank the Society for hosting us today.
Thank you, Brendan. Neil Thagard from the Nez Perce tribe. Not sure if Neil was able, he had a conflict this morning. He was going to try to join. He may join us later. So with that, I'll go to Jason Blades from the Eastern Shoshone and part of the National Wildlife Federation.
Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all. I'm on the Intertribal Buffalo Council Board as secretary, and I also work for the National Wildlife Federation's Tribal Partnerships Program as a Tribal Buffalo Program Manager, and working to build our capacity at Wind River for the Eastern Shoshone tribe, as well as the Northern Arapaho, to implement policy to manage them as wildlife on larger landscapes. And so very glad to be included with all of you, and I appreciate this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. So as you can see, we have a really great panel put together. So we hope to have a great discussion. And with that now, we'll just jump right into a little bit of the background information from Tom France and Monty Mills about the law and policy in regards to this topic.
Yeah, I would, I'll just say that 2 years ago now, Monty and I embarked on a vision document on buffalo conservation on public lands, and between NWF and the Indian Law Clinic, we did a lot of research in how law policy and have worked for buffalo conservation. And I think the report we put out was very strong, and I will ask Monty to explain the findings that we made in terms of the laws and policies that support tribal engagement, tribal co-management, and tribal leadership, not just on reservation lands when it comes to buffalo conservation, but across America's public lands as well.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I will be very brief because I am excited to hear the rest of the panel and certainly have many fascinating issues to get to. But I will say, I mean, it is quite refreshing to follow Martha already discussing the federal government's trust responsibilities and government to government relationships, which have formed, as she put it, a cornerstone of federal Indian law and policy for centuries now, ever since the earliest decisions of the United States Supreme Court recognizing the importance of that trust relationship and its centrality to the federal government's obligations and duties to tribes. Now, importantly, that trust relationship is rooted in the treaty relationship between the United States and tribes, and both treaties and the trust relationship come together, in particular, I think, with regard to thinking about the types of relationships and the ways in which the federal and tribal governments can work together, particularly around bison and particularly around the restoration of bison on public lands. Of course, in particular examples that we'll probably hear about later, there are specific treaties and agreements between tribes in the United States, including in particular the Lame Bull Treaty of 1855 and the Agreement of 1895 along the Rocky Mountain front between Blackfeet and the United States. Although, as I'm sure we will discuss, it may not be fair to actually call that document an agreement given the historical context surrounding that agreement and the relationship between the United States and the tribes at the time. So both those treaties and their specific promises, and especially in the context of the Lame Bull Treaty, the recognition and guarantee by the United States of common hunting grounds and recognition of the perpetuation of traditional lifeways by Indigenous people across Montana, recognize and support the partnerships and the durable partnerships that Martha began our session talking about. I will say, however, even though there is that support there for too long, and particularly historically, while the trust relationship may have formed the cornerstone of federal Indian law and policy, it hasn't always been incorporated or even considered in the context of the management of public lands and resources. And unfortunately, both the physical exclusion through the dispossession of tribes from their territories and the legal exclusion of tribes through the separation of public lands and those continuing connections that tribes have to them in the management laws and statutes and regulations that apply on public lands has really caused this separation between tribal priorities and interests in public lands and historically, at least, the way those lands have been managed. Of course, as you've already heard, that is changing, and largely thanks to the leadership of tribes asserting their own sovereignty around restoring those connections, both as a legal matter, but also as a functional, practical matter across public lands. And what better way to continue to fulfill and expand the federal government's trust responsibilities than to do so across lands that for generations since time immemorial have been intimately connected with the people and tribes on which have existed there. So in terms of the legal basis for thinking about bison restoration, there's foundational notions of federal Indian law that come into play, and really the process of moving forward and the progress that's been made both through the recognition in executive orders such as Secretary Jewell's 2016 Executive Order 3342, promoting partnerships between the federal government and particular public land management agencies and tribes, the Bison Initiative that you've already heard about. All of these are efforts to overcome that historical exclusion and really better fulfill the trust and treaty obligations of the United States. And how better to do that than in the case of working with tribes in a durable government to government partnership to restore bison across the public lands. I'm excited for further discussions and stand ready to be a resource if there are questions about additional laws and policies. I'll turn it back over to Tom France. I think you're on mute, Tom.
I just, thanks. I just observed that a lot of law is made when litigation occurs. A lot of important Indian law has been made through the courts. And I think where Monty and the research that we did shows a path forward through litigation that could be very powerful and be analogous to what the Northwest tribes have been able to achieve by way of recognition of their rights where it comes to salmon recovery. When I listened to Martha this morning and the Secretary of Interior Haaland, I think the path forward is through government to government discussions, through working groups between the tribes and federal land management and wildlife agencies. And I look at the next 3 years under the Biden administration as a tremendous opportunity, if we put our minds to it, to take these legal concepts and to work together to achieve the outcome that they're all about. And that's at least where buffalo are concerned, restoring buffalo to landscapes from which they've been absent for more than a century, and to do so in a way that I think will honor our conservation legacy and our duties to the tribes.
We lost Tom.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where he went, but I will keep my eye out for him.
Well, we might have lost him. Let's go ahead and go right to Keith Ani, and have Keith.
Sure. Everybody can hear me okay? And I'm going to go off video and actually do a screen share, and hopefully you'll see what you need to see. It worked a little while ago, so we'll see. Does everybody see that?
Try it again, Keith. Maybe everyone sees it but me. Does everyone else see it? No. Try it again, Keith.
That work?
It's coming on.
I remember my system is slow.
Yeah. There it is.
You guys see it?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to try to be brief too, so we can get to the panelists, because there's a lot in this report we kind of produced. It's sort of a concept of how this could proceed, but I want to clarify, there's a lot of players involved in input to this. This is not a Keith Ani thing. And I also want to clarify, and I'm going to spend some time talking about it. There's this huge, as Monty said, this huge historical cultural background, and there's been a lot of ways ideas have been fed and brought into this idea of establishing an intertribal bison herd on public lands. This didn't just erupt out of nowhere, and it goes back a long, long time. Let's see if I can page here. Well, I don't know why. There you go. This story, as you all know, is an ancient story. And this is why I think it's so important to have this clarity of the historical context. It really is important. And even planning to go forward, we have to figure out how all this historical and cultural perspective applies. And it does. It's very, very important. And so all through the concept we've derived at, we try to weave in as much as possible the importance of this historical cultural perspective. And this goes from ancient times all the way up to the time of manifest destiny and the changes in the West that happened when Euro-Americans arrived. There's just so many aspects of this that are so important. And it also is important to realize this is a sort of an ecological perspective too. We nearly lost bison. We came very, very close to losing bison. I think less than 1,000 existed at one point in time. And the fact that we're coming back from that place is just a remarkable story. And we should celebrate that to a degree. There was a great bison recovery. Bison basically were saved from 5 captive herds and 2 remaining free-ranging bison herds. That includes Yellowstone Park and then Wood Buffalo National Park. And that story is also important in our efforts to restore this species. And that brings us up to where the animal is today. And I used to be the chair of the IUCN Bison Specialist Group. We did a Red List review. Red List is like the Endangered Species Act of the globe. And bison always bubble right at the edge of vulnerable status, right at the edge. And I have to be honest with you, the threatened and endangered status of IUCN, these animals are almost gone when they get to that stage. I really don't think this Red List work it needs to be reformed, and there is an effort to do that, to create what they call the Green List. But much of the future of bison at some point rested in those 2 large herds from Yellowstone and Wood Buffalo. And there was a low risk of extinction. We have calculated that, but there's a very narrow group of bison involved in this restoration effort. I also want to point to the fact there were a lot of federal initiatives. That federal story is very, very important. And I'm glad there are federal partners on this call, because they have made great strides in the past. They have a lot of historical perspective of their own, and they're bringing this forward. And so in more recent times, many of you may or may not know, there's been a DOI bison conservation initiative for quite some time. And there's been various steps to advance that, but very little on the ground anymore. And we need to get on the ground with this. And that's where I think this intertribal bison project is so important, because we're talking about putting buffalo on the ground, not just talking about agreements and plans and everything else. We need to get to the point of putting bison on the ground somewhere. And there's a lot of work going on in that regard. I want to recognize the Intertribal Buffalo Council, very important, doing some great work and working principally within the tribes themselves. And that's been a very, very important, catapult to get to these initiatives, to bring bison back and to do some of these wonderful things. And here's a list of some of them that are actually pretty recent if you look at this. And that's a great story. That's inspirational. That should lead us to think about, well, how do we go to the next level? And my own view is the next level is getting beyond the reservation boundary onto public lands where there are treaty rights, where there's legal rights, and pushing beyond that boundary. Most of these projects have really been within a reservation boundary, and that's great. Also to nudge the states to push them a little bit. Some are taking off and going forward, and some are not. And we'll get into that in a bit. But there's some great initiatives out there, and including some NGOs that are doing some great work. And we should not discount that there can be a partnership with NGOs in the future. This whole concept of shared stewardship is fundamental to this idea that we propose. It's shared stewardship that's a fundamental tenet to it. In addition, and I hope Leroy's listening, but there's the Buffalo Treaty itself. Here was an idea that brought the tribes together, and they signed this treaty and agreed with one another to do some things for buffalo. And we need to push that now to where, okay, what are the things we can do? So this leads us to the CMR and the idea of buffalo there. And we've been bouncing this idea of restoring bison to public lands there for a long time. I go back to the time when we had one of the very first meetings when APR was just a very beginning at the stages of beginning, and we had BLM and we had all the partners there, and everybody said heads were going up and down, we should do this, but we just couldn't get anywhere. And the state tried to launch some things, and people need to be aware of that. It was promoted and there was opportunity there, but that door seems to be closing. So then the question is, so what can we do? And where we've come to is that there's growing interest in a tribal-led initiative. And Tom France and Tom, I think McDonald, you were there too, and others went to the Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders Council and said, look, here's something we could consider. And they passed a resolution to support that effort. So I bring this up because what I'm going to talk to you briefly about, and we would like to discuss more fully and evolve more fully, is that there could be an effort to led by the tribes to restore a bison in the thousands, perhaps, to a lot of public acres in places like the CMR. And so this is a great opportunity in North America. And I do want to tell you, this would be a pilot. This would be something that can be reproduced elsewhere, but a very important pilot to go to this project area you see here in central Montana and launch an initiative to restore bison there. there's land available. We particularly zeroed in this concept of the UL Bend, and there's a couple of good reasons for that, but it was a National Wildlife Refuge before CMR and then brought into the CMR. It has a lot of wilderness areas to it. It does not have cattle grazing at this point in time. And it's also geographically a nice area because it is kind of surrounded by, and it's this dark green peninsular area you see on this map. And there's some real opportunities here. And we kind of have been zooming in on that one, trying to figure out, could that be a place where a set of tribes with treaty rights there could work to restore bison and be the lead bison managers in those landscapes, working with their federal partners, the Charles M. Russell Refuge. And could this be a federal to tribe relationship that evolves into a very unique project of restoring bison? And there is, a lot of support for this idea. To be honest, we've done multiple public polls, and there's actually broad support in the public. There may be some local resistance, and we'll get to that in a bit. There's a lot of support among the NGOs, and we feel there's a pretty good support base from the tribes, the various tribes that have interest in that area. Charles M. Russell folks had actually put bison restoration into an early versions of the comprehensive plan, and it has sort of evolved into a plan that does support it, but it needs someone else to take the lead. That Charles M. Russell Refuge, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, would not necessarily be in a lead position. As the land manager, a very important partner, but in terms of land managing the animals, maybe a partner with someone else. And so what we had done is evolved this idea, and I gotta explain, this comes from so many other previous plans that have been done. The work I know I had helped with the Blackfeet plan, and Jeff Moe was on the actual working group and the tribal leaders from Blackfeet, but also, Jason Baldus's work and his plans and plans that we've seen for the National Bison Range. We've plucked out of all those efforts and planning initiatives some of the best pieces that might apply to a plan here. And the notion is to create this intertribal bison advisory council that would really oversee that effort, but also to stop it with a more bison management team that would do the on the ground aspects of this, and to do as much inclusion as can be done, bringing in professionals and resource people and a dedicated staff to work on the ground for this. And there's a set of management goals. These goals, again, are plucked out of what seems to be a good ecological cultural approach to restoring bison, establishing a self-sustaining population, restoring the ecological process. It's putting bison on the land so that what bison do with the land and that other animal community, the roles they play could be exercised. To establish a population that increases the human connection. It's the human connection that's very, very important. And we want to advance that for both tribal and non-tribal people. And they're cooperating, learning, and knowledge sharing. This is where this is a great pilot effort, but I think there's so much to be learned from one another, from people group to people group, from citizens that are local to the stakeholders, and to really advance our cultures, our respective cultures, through bison, and to successfully manage this larger scale of bison restoration while meeting some of the community needs. The idea is to be incremental, not to just dump this on the landscape real quick, but to test it, to be adaptive and moving forward in a sort of incremental approach, and to apply strong traditional ecological knowledge into that process, to even reinstate ceremonies and have special cultural events. And I think this part, engaging tribal youth, is really important. The idea that's evolved up north is to create Buffalo Guardians, a group of youth that can be involved on the ground doing things like managing the distribution and the abundance of buffalo and looking at the land relationships and doing research and studies. And of course, this is for my good friend Leroy, to also preserve linguistic legacies. There are all these tribes that have languages that speak to these things that are very important to sustain. And this could be a part of this as well. So you see that it's a cultural as well as a science and ecological experiment. There are a lot of management issues. These are laid out a little bit in the plan, and every one of you have ever written a plan know these things. I don't need to elaborate a lot. How do we do containment? We've got a strategy for that. How do you coordinate with the state and federal agencies? And there's some ideas around that. Engaging community and landowners that are nearby in this process. How do you do a tribal hunting program? This is going to be an important part of it. And I like to call out my friends from the Intertribal Buffalo Cooperative saying that consumption actually is an important part of that relationship for tribal folks. It's not just about viewing, but it's also understanding that actually consuming bison in their diets is very important. How would there be, or could there be, a non-tribal hunting program that they initiate? Viewing and tourism, managing the populations and addressing issues of carrying capacity, conducting the research and monitoring, thinking about the genetic integrity. One of the wonderful things right now is there are a lot of tribal bison herds that are pretty incredible, between the National Bison Range, with Elk Island bison at Blackfeet, with Yellowstone bison at Fort Peck and at Fort Belknap. But you don't need to go anywhere else to find really high quality genetic bison for this project. And how you, of course, do disease and herd health. And of course, this is all going to be wrapped up in an adaptive framework. Adaptive frameworks, I know we like to use that buzz term, and especially in the white world, we think it's new. Hey, you know, ancient people have been working under an adaptive framework for tens of thousands of years. So anyway, I'll try to wrap this up, but some next steps, you know, we need to constantly improve this concept with additional input and to work with the tribal councils and leaders to gain their support. There's talk about possibly a meeting or a field trip out into the CMR area so they can see it. Engaging tribal elders and leaders all through this project is very, very important in terms of the next steps. There's going to be need for some legal instruments, and I'll leave that to Monty and Tom France and others, and to Paul Santavy, but you know, there's going to probably be need to be some formal MOUs established, and to be hosting a lot of stakeholder and public meetings to increase public understanding and get their engagement in it. And of course, very important is to establish a good communication strategy to sort of fend off opposition and gain some level of support for the project. So with that, that's a brief explanation of some of the idea that is emerging, and it's out there and it's in the report that Tom France and Tom McDonald gave to the tribal leaders. I like to close with this Adolf Murray quote that let us not have puny thoughts, think on a greater scale, and not have those in the future decry our smallness of concept and lack of foresight. I find this to be an inspirational idea. We're breaking out of a mold here, and it's a very, very important one to consider. And I hope you all join in and support this initiative. Thanks.
Thank you, Keith. Great presentation. So what I'd love to do on tagging on top of Keith's presentation, I'd like to go to the panel presenters, and again, all the folks that have been presented so far, and all of the panelists can chime in at any time on any of these questions that we have developed. The questions are kind of targeted for individual panelists, but we want to have an open discussion with everybody in a dialogue as best we can to maximize the expertise on this panel and the presenters. So with that, I'd like to jump in with Paul at CMR, and just with the comprehensive conservation plan that the CMR calling for the potential reestablishment of buffalo with partnership with tribes and other parties. How would you envision the steps for tribes working with the service to accomplish that shared goal at the CMR?
Thanks, Tom. So this summer, we started what we're referring to as phase 1 on a tribal and stakeholder engagement process, focused on kind of broad wildlife and habitat management issues at CMR, but specifically highlighting bison and bighorn sheep reintroduction possibilities. So we're finishing that up right now, phase 1. This month, we should be done with the first round of tribal government and tribal group interviews, and then non-tribal stakeholders. And what we're going to get out of that is we're going to get an engagement strategy and a communication plan. And the whole purpose of us starting with this engagement was really to focus on engagement science and kind of the newest updated information we have in social science, with really trying to delve into identifying who is interested in talking about these topics at CMR. What specifically are they interested in these topics? And then really importantly, how do they prefer to be engaged? We have a long history, certainly in the Fish and Wildlife Service and probably broadly the federal government, of trying to engage interested partners and stakeholders with a kind of a one blanket, one strategy fits all type of approach. And it often doesn't work very well for us. So invested in this first phase, trying to learn what people's preferences are. And like I said, we're finishing that up right now. We're going to roll directly into phase 2. Phase 2 is when we're going to use what we learned in phase 1, both on, what tribal governments and groups and stakeholders are interested in continuing to engage in these discussions, talking about these topics, looking for pathways forward, and use what we learned about how, what kind of engagement strategies they prefer. And we're going to jump in and start talking about substantive issues with, most likely we're going to be focusing on bison, because that's what we've heard from everybody. That's what most people are interested in talking about. We are likely going to establish one or more working groups. I suspect we're going to start multiple working groups that will be managing simultaneously. And we'll also be developing other venues, again, based on what we learned about how different groups of people want to be engaged. So during these discussions on substantive issues and managing through these working groups, we expect that there's going to be opportunity to start developing proposals that do things. Our plans are to try to get phase 2 into a mature status sometime by the spring, early summer of 2022. And we think the outcomes of that work will then give senior Fish and Wildlife Service leadership the opportunity to make a determination on what did we learn, what's the interest, what kind of collaboration are we pulling together, and is it strong enough? Is there interest enough? Is it developed enough to then consider starting a formal public NEPA analysis using potentially those developed proposals as alternatives in NEPA. So that was a long answer. To recap, my vision for how we move forward and what kind of steps we need to take, I just went through and outlined, and I think we've already started it. We're moving along. We think within the next 6 to 8 months, we'll have something that's very mature and developed. During phase 2, certainly there's going to be more stakeholder engagement outside of the specific working groups. I think it's very possible that we might move forward with consultation, a formal consultation with tribes. And the one thing I left out is there will need to likely be an update to just the bison objectives and the comprehensive conservation plan for CMR, but that's something that we can do probably in concert with any sort of NEPA analysis that we do. So I think we're in a great place. Like I said, I think we've taken a big step forward with tribal and stakeholder engagement that's specific to the Fish and Wildlife Service and CMR National Wildlife Refuge. I know other organizations have done some of this work a little bit differently earlier, as Keith's alluded to, but that's how I envision things moving forward. A really important aspect of this is the existence of tribal leadership and continued dialogue and collaboration in the Fish and Wildlife Service, specifically in this instance, continuing to learn what tribal governments and tribal groups want and are interested in. So formats like this are absolutely necessary. Our ongoing listening sessions that we're doing with DOI and USDA and tribes focusing on bison, absolutely necessary. And then, any and all future collaboration, and then, like I said, actual stepping into formal consultation. That's all information that we'll continue to use and learn to help guide any sort of activities, planning, and formal processes that we get going. I wonder if there's any questions about any of that.
Thank you, Paul. I guess any other panelists that would have anything specifically to add to that question or Paul's response? I know one question for you, Paul. I did participate in the phase 1. Is there going to be a preliminary document or summary of that would be available soon?
Yeah. So, like I said, we're thinking we're going to finish up the first round interviews in the next couple of weeks, and then Sean Johnson and his team will be developing that draft. We'll be summarizing the information, developing a draft strategy, and the plan is to share that with all stakeholders as part of the process of getting that to a kind of a final draft and looking at something we can start to implement. So yes, absolutely. All the participating tribes and non-tribal stakeholders will get a chance to look at that.
Great. The connecting to that for getting, there's many proposals out, there's many ideas as we've talked about before, but and Keith talked about sources of buffalo, but in particular for Robbie Magnan at Fort Peck, with their herd in the quarantine facility that's there that receives Yellowstone bison, would buffalo from Fort Peck be a potential source population for herds restored on federal lands?
Yes, they would. We first started out giving breeding bulls to tribes that were interested in enhancing their genetics of their herds. And we have now grown to where we give family groups to tribes. We've already successfully given one family group out. And in December, we'll be giving 2 more family groups out. And I've been working with Yellowstone, and they'll be getting us some more. And that is our goal, to help buffalo restored in Indian country and elsewhere. And CMR Russell would be a great place to put them.
That's what Robbie, I guess one question, what's your relationship then with the Intertribal Bison Council and with the herd in quarantine?
Okay, presently, when we have buffaloes off the other tribe, ITBC helps put out proposals to tribes that are interested in them. And they put out proposal, and ITBC pays for all the costs of shipping them wherever they are given to. They help us with that.
Okay. I'd like to talk about, I don't know if Jeff's back on with us or not. So Steph, can you see if Jeff Mao's back on?
I'm here. Yeah.
Okay, Jeff. Good. I'm glad you're back. Can you share, a vision for a transboundary herd in the crown of the continent, and what steps are needed for that? I know there's been a lot of work on that. So.
Sure, and needless to say, Keith and others on this call have been a big part of that. So I'll sort of share my perspective on that. But I think it sort of builds on that legacy that Waterton Glacier have as the world's first international peace park, built in 1932. And as the superintendent at Waterton Lakes and myself, is this additive to the International Peace Park, or is this a whole sort of initiative on its own to think about a transboundary free-ranging bison herd across what we considered a shared landscape, and managed as a shared resource? And so, there's a lot to work through for sure, but the reality is, if the idea of a free-ranging bison herd that's released by the tribe, process-wise, as federal agencies, wildlife come in and out of our lands all the time, and so, I think there's that sort of interest in ensuring that we can pass a red face test, I guess, that these are wildlife that sort of would roam on this shared landscape across the international boundary and in and out of the park moving forward. So it's certainly a different approach, I think, than what I heard Paul talk about, just in terms of how we look at that. And it's not really our plan. It's not really our restoration of bison. We are certainly very supportive of it. We see this as, for me, it's one of the most meaningful, transformational sort of efforts I've been in. And like he said, it's not just about conservation. It's just not about bringing an umbrella species back to an ecosystem. It's very much a culture.
Hey, Jeff, you are muted for some reason. I don't know why.
Oh, sorry. Did I go on unmute? Did I?
Yeah, you were talking and all of a sudden it went to mute. I'm not sure why.
Okay, well, I did get a pop-up anyway. Sorry about that. So hopefully, I guess I was just going to wrap up and just say that, I think this initiative really is that sort of triple bottom line in terms of being about conservation, being about cultural initiative, huge opportunities, I think, for the tribe to reconnect with their youth, and otherwise in many ways to reconnect across the medicine line or the international boundary, and then the economic opportunities. So I think it's really an important sort of tribally led initiative for us to be part of. And I think it fits well with our model of, what we do as, in terms of preserving a landscape or ensuring that a landscape exists as Glacier National Park moving forward. So.
That's
And
great.
I go to
Jeff.
Keith to see what comments he has, because, again, he's been so inspirational for me in terms of thinking about this and why, it's worth us putting ourselves out there a little bit to move forward in this.
Well, we've had the good fortune of working with you, of course, and others, Waterton. I mean, the fun part of this really was engaging the elder dialogues, and I learned so much from them. But that framework helped those of us like Jeff and the superintendent Waterton and others to sort of embrace it. It was easy to embrace it then. It wasn't hard. And then the hard work, of course, like all these things, is actually doing it. And so we got to kind of get past the dialogue and the conceptualizing into realizing the dream. And I'm thankful that we have people like Jeff there to sort of keep it alive.
And if I just might add that, at this time, we have this opportunity too, in working with Buzz and his department and the interest in elk and what's going on there, and the council's interest in setting aside some of what had previously been grazing lands adjacent to the park to set them aside for wildlife, I think are golden opportunities for us to sort of collaborate even more on a shared landscape, for what's possible moving forward and what could support the initiative moving forward.
That's a good segue for us to ask Buzz Cobell to as I call him, as a fresh set of old eyes on the landscape, with his return to managing fish and wildlife on the Blackfeet reservation. I guess the question for Buzz, what would he think would be Buzz, what do you think the big challenges are for establishing this transboundary herd?
So appreciate the opportunity to kind of shed some light on some of the obstacles and opportunities we have ahead of us. I think from the Blackfeet standpoint, we're kind of right in the middle of it as far as the hard work that's been talked about. But I do think we're making progress. I've heard, someone mention incremental approach. I think that kind of is something that we have to keep in mind. Since I've come on board here, kind of my second go around as the Fish and Wildlife Director for Blackfeet, I noticed that we're not making progress as fast as maybe we'd like, but we're making progress. And the Blackfeet Tribal Business Council recently set aside 6 range units, over 18,000 acres of land that we're going to be managing for wildlife, and the ENI initiative and our plans to restore bison to the Chief Mountain area, I think, is getting closer to a reality. I think the Blackfeet Tribal Business Council is very supportive of this approach, and I think that would spin off into this larger concept of restoring bison back to CMR and Montana, because the same kind of issues are there. We need to kind of work through some of the challenges of, once you put these animals on the landscape. I think, Jeff has mentioned he's working with us as far as bison going into Glacier, but as far as controlling the bison on the reservation side of things, we're going to have to work real hard on fencing and keeping these animals where we want them to be, and not creating any enemies or opposition because they're getting out, or maybe we didn't think things through as well as we should have. But I do think that the support is there. We're very interested in working with some NGOs that have been identified. Dylan DeRozier here on the reservation for the Nature Conservancy has been very helpful in helping us build collaboration with some nonprofits that are going to help us replace the allotee portion of the grazing revenue that's realized from the range units we set aside. And that's going to be real helpful too as we look at instituting range assessments and kind of vegetative management projects, wildlife research, and all the things that are going to help us kind of what I would call kind of an educational process to help our tribal members understand how we've shifted from using this landscape, you know, for grazing and forestry and those kinds of activities. But now we're going to be managing this Chief Mountain area for religious, cultural, and wildlife conservation purposes. We have a population of West Slope cutthroat that's pure strain in this area. And so by us kind of educating our tribal membership as to the benefits of managing it differently than it has been over the years, I think that kind of educational process is something that we'll probably have to do in regards to CMR and how the history of that area goes back a lot further than statehood, you know. So the Blackfeet Nation, of course, we're very interested in this proposal. We're very excited about it. I think, like you pointed out, and it was very, I was pleased to see Martha Williams in the position she's in with her history working here in Montana with the tribes, and now she's working for the Fish and Wildlife Service, an agency I've worked for 11 years, my federal career before I retired. So it's good to see that these federal agencies are embracing federal Indian trust responsibility and working government to government. I think that's the key to this whole process. I think knowing the history of the landscape and the peoples that lived and survived there for all these many years, we definitely want to work to sustain and conserve the bison. And I think the other part of it that I haven't mentioned is like the Blackfeet Confederacy was cut into 1/3 and 2/3 when that medicine line or the boundary between the US and Canada went in. But we're still cognizant of our brothers and sisters to the north, and we want to work and maintain that relationship, that use of the resource like we always have. And I think a recent court case that occurred with the Cobell people, where some of their members are now recognized as being able to exercise their rights in Canada, that just, again, supports this whole idea of recognizing the history of the Indian people and our ties to the landscape and the animals that use that landscape, our brothers, the emu, the buffalo. We want to make sure that continues. And I feel like the work that I'm doing kind of in a small microcosm of this bigger picture here on Blackfeet is that we're going to make it work. And I think people like Jeff Mao and the position he's in is key. It's not so much the government policies as a whole, as our attorney from the law clinic in Missoula pointed out, it's the framework is there to be put into place, make things like this happen. But we need people like Jeff Mao and Martha Williams in those positions to utilize that power and those mandates and help us to get to where we need to go to conserve bison in Montana. And I really think all ingredients are on the table for us to make that happen. I'm very excited to see all of us talking about it. But I feel like From a tribal standpoint, I think we here at Blackfeet can put together a on the ground bison restoration project that could spill over into this larger discussion that we're having about the CMR.
Well, thank you, Buzz. That's boy, that's great words and a lot going on there. And it's a good segue when we talk about Department of Interior. That's a good segue to have Brendan talk about the Department of Interior's Bison Conservation Initiative. And he's one of the leaders, actually helped draft it. And so I guess a question for Brendan would be, you know, we talk about these two projects specifically, the transboundary potential herd, the CMR. So basically in that DOI initiative, how does the DOI really honor the commitment for these herds at these two places? And is that all that the initiative would deal with as far as establishing bison herds on large landscapes? So let's hear from Brendan a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And maybe I'll take that second part first and say that you know, both of these efforts for the transboundary herd establishment at CMR and Glacier would certainly be under that umbrella of the vision to support establishment of new large free-ranging herds. I also think it's quite easy to say that they would not fulfill the total vision of what is intended under the BCI. So there's a bigger vision, a bigger look than just those two projects. And Keith has convinced me to not think puny thoughts. And there are other examples out there where there's high potential. He showed one map of that highlighted the Medno Ranch and the transboundary opportunity at the Baca National Wildlife Refuge abutting Great Sand Dunes National Park. That's one that's been discussed for a couple of decades, but has some fresh breath into it over the last year or two since we've initiated the BCI. And there are other examples too that don't necessarily require or build on a foundation of a federal landholding. I do think that, you know, to echo one of the thoughts of a good friend who's on the call here too, Dennis Jorgensen, one of the key pieces in these initiatives that we're seeing at both Glacier and CMR, Glacier Blackfeet and CMR, and that we've seen elsewhere is the absolutely essential component of having an identified and identifiable, describable landscape, a land base. So it kind of gets to Keith's point about, you know, the philosophy and the overall direction in policy is important, but translating that to restoration actions on the ground is really important as well. So in terms of honoring the commitments of the BCI to tribes, states, and other stakeholders, you know, I think that there are several ways to do that. Some are going to be at that local, relatively local scale, meaning the scale of a landscape, a particular proposal. You know, perhaps it's at the level of an individual national park unit, National Wildlife Refuge, or a BLM field office. Others are going to be much broader, and they involve things like collaboratively working on a bison conservation framework at a national scale that really builds on these two commitments that Martha highlighted so well early on. And those two commitments being a very intentional effort to link ecology with cultural conservation and restoration. And the second concept being a commitment to shared stewardship. Now, specifically regarding tribes and commitments to tribes, on November 3rd this year, we'll have the third listening session co-hosted by USDA, DOI, and ITBC also as a third co-host. And these listening sessions are focused on hearing from tribes on concerns, suggestions, recommendations for improving and strengthening bison conservation and management. Specifically, this third session focuses on access by tribes to federal bison. more generally, regarding all partners, including states, tribes, and NGOs, one big opportunity that's on the near horizon, will be the development of a DOI shared stewardship plan. So that's action 2 under the 2020 Bison Conservation Initiative. It will almost certainly involve formal consultation with tribes. It will also engage states, NGOs, and livestock interests. But it's important to point out that shared stewardship plan isn't about pursuing shared stewardship for its own purpose. That approach and that relationship to each other is important. But the scope of that shared stewardship plan under the BCI is specifically oriented toward this goal of large, free roaming bison herds, conservation herds, new herds. One way that we're working at the Bison Working Group to very intentionally develop an approach based on these principles is to first focus on kind of the inward-looking aspects of bison conservation. Their conservation genetics work, which is action 1 under the BCI, and commitments to low-stress handling and viewing and managing bison as wildlife, and that's action 4 under the BCI. This is the work that we, as DOI bureaus, have internally to manage the national mammal in a coordinated, strategic, and appropriate way on landscapes and as wildlife. But there's also this kind of second family of activities at the Bison Working Group level. And they're related to action 2, which is improving the mechanisms for delivering live bison to tribes, and action 3, which is this shared stewardship strategy. And this second grouping is really about envisioning and articulating the role and the contributions that DOI bureaus can make as part of a community, this community represented on the call today, that is working toward cooperative bison restoration. So there are a lot of examples where federal herds can be the scaffolding, if you will, upon which others' conservation successes and visions can be built. So there are examples with the 2 publicly hunted herds in Utah, Oak Cliffs and Henry Mountains. There are commitments to jumpstart efforts like the Wolacota regenerative buffalo range at Rosebud. We have the continued development, the growth, the adjustment of partnerships like the Yellowstone Quarantine Program with the IBMP and the key role played by Fort Peck tribes. It's about ensuring that CSKT understands that it has a community of support at the ready, committed to supporting its success as defined by them. It involves continued partnership with ITBC to distribute and deliver live bison to member tribes. But the overall point of that grouping of community is to frame the federal capability in bison conservation and federal resources as seeds and framework that others can build on. So to be even a little bit more specific, and I'll wrap up here, we're having a lot of discussions internally that recognize that it is not for the Park Service or Fish and Wildlife Service or BLM or the Department of Interior to tell a tribe whether their vision for bison in their communities, on their landscapes, or through partnership with other partners, whether that meets a particular federal or Western definition of conservation. So it means that we must impose some humility upon ourselves for the role that the federal government can and should play in this regard. And the second thing that I want to point out is kind of a closing thought here is that at the Bison Working Group, I'm trying to frame a lot of discussions with ourselves internally and with partners in these opportunities to communicate with each other, that there's a real opportunity here to move from a model of scarcity, meaning the annual allocation and division and distribution of a relatively small and fixed number of bison that flow from federal herds, to move from that to one of increased abundance. And that abundance model relies on proposals and visions and actions, just like the proposal for the CMR and for the Blackfeet Glacier in the initiative project, where multiple entities come together, we generate and establish new herds, we move well beyond the current 11,000 federal bison, and we operate as a conservation community to deliver more bison to tribes and to the public from a variety of sources.
Thank you, Brendan. I think Tom France has maybe a follow-up question for you.
Yeah, I just interject here from the lawyer's perspective. I appreciate Paul's comments about understanding how different publics are interested in bison and the best way to interact with them. And Brendan, I certainly appreciate your vision of how to move the bison initiative forward. But the lawyer in me says, eventually, sooner rather than later, and hopefully sooner, any proposal is going to have to go through a NEPA process. And that is sort of its own very legally defined set of actions that federal agencies must take to impact the environment. And I think putting a herd at CMR, establishing a transboundary herd between Glacier, Waterton, Canada, and the US, I think there will have to be an environmental impact statement. I would.
Looks like we lost Tom again.
I'm right back. I just would encourage the federal and tribal managers to realize that a goal here should be getting to that NEPA process. And that means framing a proposal for action and then recognizing that NEPA will take its own set of resources and certainly its own schedule. And even if we were to start today with an EIS for a transboundary herd or CMR, if that announcement came out in the Federal Register that FWS or NPS were going to do an EIS, we're talking about a 2-year, maybe 3-year process. And just as we go forward, to be thinking in that frame and trying to maybe incorporate some of the strategies that you're talking about by way of engaging the public into that NEPA process might get us to decisions faster than sort of a step down process where we do all this higher level planning and then get to NEPA and add 3 years onto whatever that the processes we're discussing here today are going to take us. And to me, that's very critical in terms of looking at this administration, which is very interested in these issues, I think prepared to make decisions if they get the right documents done. And there's a hard date there in November of 2024 where this administration will be judged and will decide whether we want to go in a different direction as a country. So I just would say to all of us to recognize that the law requires an environmental impact statement and a formal decision to put bison on almost any federal landscape.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts, Tom, and I welcome comments from others. First on the top-down comment in the BCI, the BCI, as Keith mentioned, is not the first one. So the first was signed in 2008 by then Secretary Kemp Thorne under President Bush. The most current one under Secretary Bernhardt in the Trump administration. We have broad-based, strong support for creative conservation approaches on bison across the political spectrum. So that's a real important thing for us to notice. The foundations for the BCI don't spring it anew from this moment. They build on all that previous work. So that, but there are two key points about the new BCI that are exceptionally important developments that set the framework for the proposals that you're talking about today. One is, and it's betrayed by the lack of words and number of sentences in the BCI about this, but the recognition by DOI of bison as native North American wildlife is really important. That sets the position of DOI in this discussion relative to their classification by some as livestock. The second is that the BCI 2020 goes well beyond the first initiative in that we pivot. We say we're going to continue our work on the internal commitments of conservation genetics and how we manage bison internally, but we also pivot and say we're part of a broader conservation world, a broader conservation community, and DOI is committed to linking ecology and culture. So those two things are important. On NEPA, I'll punt to others. I see Paul's queued up and Jeff can comment as well, but the two proposals that are being discussed today are very, very different. So the CMR process would likely, from my estimation, be in that classic NEPA world. There'd be a proposal that the federal government would respond to and go through an analysis of alternatives, come up with a preferred alternative and move forward. The NE initiative proposed by the Blackfeet people for establishment of a herd on tribal lands that then may migrate seasonally onto federal lands is a completely different situation. And it's really helped by having that piece in the BCI where we recognize bison as wildlife. So it's not clear at all. In fact, it may be unlikely that the Park Service would have to complete a NEPA analysis on the Blackfoot Glacier piece, because it would be a question of what does the Park Service do when animals that we recognize as wildlife move on to federal lands. So I'll stop there and ask Paul and Jeff to comment on that as well.
Yeah, thanks. Very well said, Brendan. Tom, I know you blipped off for a while, and I don't know if you were on when I answered my panel question or not, but I'm not going to go through all of it again. I don't want to put everybody through that, but the punchline at the end was we're doing stakeholder engagement. We're going to bring people together, develop working groups, other sort of engagement venues. We're likely going to develop one or more proposals. And then that's when the critical question gets to, do we have enough? Are we on strong enough footing to move forward with NEPA? And maybe you're right, it's an EIS, maybe it's an EA, I'm not sure. But I think there's a very good chance, in our timeline we're working on is we'd like to get to that stage in spring of 2022, where we have our engagement info, we know what our stakeholders are thinking. We have one or more proposals that could look like alternatives in an EA or an EIS. And then our senior leadership, regional director, or all the way up to Martha, makes a decision, yes, start an EIS, or yes, start an EA. So heard what you said loud and clear. Absolutely agree with you. And it's part of the sausage making for sure. So we're already thinking about that. Just not quite there yet, but we're getting close. Thank you.
I just put a thumbs up to both those answers. I think they're very thoughtful, and I just think as we plan, we need to be cognizant of these other legal requirements and responsibilities. And I'd only add, Brendan, I appreciate that, and it's surprised many in my community that Secretary Bernhardt signed off on the Bison Conservation Initiative. And I don't want to discount that this is transcends sort of the party polarization in some ways. That said, I think Secretary Haaland and her team are really interested in this. And I just want to make sure we provide them with the decision space and the time they need to reflect on some of these issues that they only imagined we're talking about.
Mr. France?
Yes.
This is Tina. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to get off of the meeting. Something came up. So if I sent a chat out, but if you can call me and get me the minutes for the meeting and what's going on and everything, maybe just a short synopsis of what happened, so I can get it out to our tribal leaders, that would be great.
We will do that. We will get a link out since we're recording this, so anyone can watch this, and
Okay.
we'll circulate it broadly, Tina. And
Okay.
thanks so much for your participation for the Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to say hi to Monty and good to see you. I will be in touch with you soon, Monty.
Thanks, Tina. You know, that's a good reminder that we're running out of time fastly. So I do want to ask Jason, as a panelist, hasn't had a chance to speak yet, to briefly talk about his involvement with Intertribal Bison Council and how that agency or NGO might be involved with this restoration.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate the conversation. You know, the Intertribal Buffalo Council has a membership of 76 tribes, and it continues to grow each year. And ITBC, as a federally chartered sovereign organization, has a tremendous role in working with and collaborating with many interests. We were in DC last week advocating for the Indian Buffalo Management Act, which would essentially appropriate money to ITBC and the Buffalo tribes as a treaty right, in a similar way that the Bolt decision applies to the salmon tribes. And this effort of ITBC, despite only operating on $1 million and a bit more per year, has funneled that money directly to our tribe, our member tribes. And the IBMA is a step in the right direction in terms of allowing the ability of our member tribes through herd development grants to improve our ability to get buffalo back into our communities for cultural and spiritual reasons. There's been some concerns with the BCI with ITBC, and I think it's a key time to increase the consultation. You know, we have the BLM. We got Tracy Stone Manning in that position, and as we talk about CMR, looping in some of these key individuals. We were able to meet with National Park Service and Zach Ducheneau, and helping to mitigate some of these challenges that we face locally with increased regulations by states by bringing buffalo into those states. North Dakota has made it increasingly difficult. Wyoming is asking for vaccinations of incoming females. So we have to be able to effectively change from the top down. And so consultation and ITBC as a sovereign organization is very important to be included in those conversations. There's issues with surplus animals of DOI and ensuring that those animals have the ability to go to our member tribes of ITBC. There's a wide range of ability of tribes in our membership. Some are large land-based tribes, but many are small land-based tribes. And so ensuring that some of those smaller land-based tribes have the same capability of restoring bison to their communities is an important step as well. We have to continually compete with the livestock industry, and bison being considered livestock in many states makes it very difficult to stress the ecological and biological importance of this keystone species on our landscapes. And so there's a letter that ITBC has drafted that's gone to National Park Service as of this morning, addressing some of these issues that ITBC sees. But partnership and collaboration, very important in this. The Nature Conservancy, the National Park Service has been a great partner with ITBC. We just want to ensure that we have that seat at the table to be included in these conversations, and ensure that we have that continued voice for our member tribes, and increase that ability to get more funding through the federal government because of the treaty right and the importance of this buffalo, not only to our landscapes, but also in our diet. And for some tribes that it makes it more difficult. So the efforts of the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, the National Wildlife Federation, many of our NGOs, we want to make sure that we have the ability to communicate well with one another so that we can address some of these concerns. But really getting that animal on the landscape is very important to our communities. The Nature Conservancy, we've got actually a large distribution of buffalo going to our member tribes in the next few weeks. And, despite having only a limited amount of funding, it's very important that we all advocate for legislation like the Indian Buffalo Management Act, the management of buffalo in places where it's possible as wildlife, and in using some of these relationships that we've been working with to support the legislation and working together to make it easier in dealing with some of these new state regulations. So, meeting with folks in Washington, hopefully we can effectively make change from the top down. We also want to ensure that Fort Peck can operate at full capacity. They've designed their facilities off of APHIS specifications, but are prevented from bringing the number of animals to Fort Peck to ensure that we're getting those genetics out and ensuring that we're not sending more animals to slaughter. And so increasing the capacity of our tribes and member tribes to be a partner in getting these live buffalo out of Yellowstone for the conservation of those genetics and improving the heterogeneity of our conservation populations, none of which are at the threshold needed to maintain that genetic heterogeneity. And we heard Keith talk about the importance of the conservation populations and getting those genetics out to improve our herds. And so, I appreciate the chance to visit with everybody about that. The tribes are a key role in this effort. The BCI is a good tool. It needs to be fixed a little bit to ensure that we have that capability. And as the possibility for additional quarantine, the money has been put into and raised to improve the quarantine there at the park, but we're still going to be sending a large number of animals to slaughter, indiscriminate of whether they have brucellosis or not. And so there's a lot of challenges still ahead of us, but conversations like this will ensure that we can continue to be advocates for one another and on the same page about how we move forward. And so I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all and to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. I would like to, we're kind of beyond our time limit, but I know there's people out there that are participating in the Zoom platform, and I'm not sure, Steph, how much time we have remaining, but if there was some questions for our panelists or presenters that people might have, we could certainly entertain that right now. Maybe Julie has some folks at Spokane that have some questions for us. If there's anything out there on the chat, Steph, you could relay to us, we could try to answer, that'd be great.
There is nothing on the chat, so if you wanted to open up
Okay.
to anyone else.
Yeah, I don't think there's any other questions by anybody participating.
Tom, this is Dennis Jorgensen with World Wildlife Fund.
Yeah,
probably
Dennis.
no one will be surprised that I'm unmuting, but just really briefly, I wanted to mention that I appreciate and support all the sentiments that have been shared today. And I just, recognizing the audience we have here and the goals that everyone has, I think that it's really important just to reiterate that though these opportunities for co-management or expansion of tribal opportunities on public lands are key, I really hope that everyone here also recognizes that we need to redouble our efforts to bring resources to tribal lands as well with respect to bison restoration. I think that in my work, I've seen incredible energy and resources out there to help support tribes in their efforts to restore bison to tribal lands. And recognizing that nearly half of tribal agricultural lands in the Northern Great Plains are in non-tribal hands, leased to non-tribal interests. I still hope that we will all do all that we can as we move these efforts forward to restore bison on public lands, to also bring the message that there need to be many more resources brought to tribal leaders, tribal interests that are restoring bison to tribal lands. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. I mean, that's a great point. I know Jason brought up the federal legislation regarding buffalo. Also, we have the Reinvesting in American Wildlife Act that's out there that needs to move through Congress, and that provides resources to the tribes, and that's a good bill to champion and support. I also would like to say that, you know, this initiative to do this, many people have said that the time is now. There's, you know, it's time to play ball, especially with Tracy at the BLM and Deb at the DOI and Martha at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You know, if you think about the moons being aligned, it certainly is one of those points in our history where we could move this ball forward. And so what I'd like to do is, Keith mentioned it earlier, I know that we want to keep this momentum going. We want to be able to look at one of these demonstration projects. That being said, the CMR, maybe do another conference or rally point this spring to review that and continue this discussion at a more detailed level and more inclusive of tribal leaders and others that would be stakeholders with this. So I think it's probably time to wrap up unless there's any other words of advice.
Tom, this is Claudio Bronco with the
Claudio,
Shoshone Tribes.
Yeah.
I'd like to get put on the list to get this information. You know, I know it's going to our council, our tribal council, and they're always in meetings. Like now they're in a general meeting and so forth. So I'd like to get put on this email so I can be involved in a lot of this, because I am the policy representative for the tribe and like to be involved in. And then I know I was talking to Leroy, and I know you and Leroy wanted to talk to me, but we need to communicate more. If I can get on the email address and so forth, then we can start addressing a lot of issues from our tribe standpoint.
Oh, absolutely, Claudio. We got you. So we'll keep you included. Absolutely. Okay. Yes.
Thank you.
Hey, Tom. Brendan
yes.
has his hand up, and then
Okay.
I do have something in the chat from Leroy that I can address.
Brendan?
Yeah, Tom, just to build on your comments, and I'll be very brief. You know, what strikes me about this conversation is that in so many conservation topics, we work to try to find that space of overlap in interests when we have diverse groups. And, you know, we hope that we can find an overlap of, you know, 10 or 20% of shared interests to find some common ground. And I think what we have here, what we're seeing today, is an overlap more on the order of 80, 90% or higher. And so what that tells me is that we're not operating just to find the least common denominator to move some of these initiatives forward, but we have a huge head of steam and a really strong, engaged community that's committed to co-creating these projects and to getting them over the finish line. Now the CMR one is a bit different, and I don't have a lot of overlap with that. That's a kind of a proposal and public process. Just as a point of encouragement, I thought that the discussion today was great in terms of highlighting how much shared interest we have in bison conservation in general and these two particular projects specifically. So thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. Leroy.
I can read what he had in the chat. I think his connection has been going off and on because I've let him in a couple different times. But
49th parallel. No.
Leroy said his information says that Deb Holland is the Secretary of Interior is going to be at MSU for the opening of the new Indian Center. He suggests sending a delegate or delegates from our group to MSU to chat with the secretary. Our chairwoman, Shelley Fayant, said she was invited to the roundtable and she will definitely bring it up. There are 2 council delegates from CSKT or from each tribe in Montana invited to this private session that will also include Tester. Also, Sean Cross in the chat room is going to have to log off. So he says, thank you for everyone participating in putting this together.
Well, thank you, Steph, for being our Zoom cat herder and facilitator. And I want to thank all the presenters and the panelists for taking the time, those that have all listened that have an interest in this. And I would hope we'll send out more invites and coordination meetings in the future. So again, thank everybody, Lemleps to Pesayal. Thank you everybody for attending this morning, just into the afternoon. And I hope everybody has a great fall ahead of them. So thank you.
See you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.